I raised Ethan like my own. When my sister passed away, he was just a boy, 10 years old, lost and broken. I was the only family he had left, and I promised myself I would protect him. Years passed, and he grew into a man, strong, kind, with a quiet confidence that made people trust him instantly. But to me, he was still the boy who used to hold my hand when he was scared of the dark. We spent years on this farm, just the two of us. Early mornings feeding the horses, long afternoons fixing fences, and evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. We talked about everything, his dreams, my regrets, the things we both wished we could change. There was never anything I couldn't tell him, and for a long time, I thought he felt the same way. But something changed when he turned 20. It was subtle at first, the way his eyes lingered on me, the way he stood just a little too close when we worked together. I told myself I was imagining it. He was just affectionate, grateful, nothing more. But then there were the touches. His fingers brushing against mine when I handed him something, his hand resting on my lower back just a little too long when we passed each other in the kitchen. I should have said something. I should have drawn a line. But I didn't. One evening, after a long day, we sat outside watching the sky fade into dusk. He turned to me, his gaze heavy, unreadable. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. I sighed, shaking my head. "This is home, Ethan. I wouldn't know where else to go." He studied me for a moment before looking away. "Sometimes I feel like I don't belong here anymore." I frowned. "Why would you say that?"
His jaw tightened.
"Because I feel things I shouldn't." My stomach twisted, but I forced a laugh. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" His eyes met mine, and in them, I saw something I wasn't ready to face. "You know what I mean," he said quietly. "I've known it for a long time. And so have you." My breath caught. This was a moment I couldn't ignore, a moment that could change everything. But instead of responding, I stood up, pretending not to understand. "You should get some rest," I said, my voice uneven. "We've got work to do in the morning."
He didn't argue.
He just watched me walk away. And as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, I knew deep down, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The night air was warm, thick with the scent of hay and the quiet hum of crickets. I had gone to the barn to clear my head, hoping that the silence would settle the unease growing inside me. But then I heard footsteps, steady, familiar. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Ethan. "I knew I'd find you here," he said, his voice soft, unreadable. I stayed where I was, hands gripping the wooden beam in front of me. "Ethan, go inside." "I can't." He stepped closer, the space between us shrinking. "Not until we talk." I closed my eyes. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is." His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it. "You feel it too. You always have." I turned to face him, forcing myself to stay firm. "You don't know what you're saying." His gaze locked onto mine. "I do. And so do you." The barn felt smaller, the air charged with something I didn't want to name. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I had spent years convincing myself that the warmth between us was nothing more than familiarity, that the way my chest tightened when he looked at me was just misplaced affection. But standing there, inches apart, I couldn't lie anymore. "This isn't right," I whispered. "Then why aren't you walking away?" His words held me in place. He reached for my hand, his touch hesitant, waiting for me to pull away. I should have. I should have told him to stop, to leave, to pretend this moment never happened. But I didn't move. The world outside the barn didn't exist. There was only him, his breath, his warmth, the way his fingers slowly traced along my wrist, up my arm. I hated the way my body responded, the way every part of me leaned into him when I knew I shouldn't. When his lips brushed against mine, it was barely a touch, a question more than an action. My breath hitched, my mind screaming at me to stop this before it went too far. But I didn't. The kiss was slow, uncertain, but it unraveled something inside me, something I had buried for years. And then reality slammed into me like a cold wind. I pulled away so fast I nearly stumbled. My hands trembled as I took a step back, shaking my head.
"No."
This can't happen. His expression was unreadable, his chest rising and falling heavily. I love you. The words hit harder than they should have. I turned and ran. Out of the barn, across the field, away from the one thing I had spent years pretending I didn't want. And as I shut the door behind me, pressing my back against it, I realized there was no escaping this. No matter how far I ran, I avoided him for days. Every time I saw him, I turned the other way. Every time he spoke, I found an excuse to leave. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't erase the feeling of his lips on mine, the way his touch had ignited something I couldn't control. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in the barn. Shame and desire tangled together in my chest, suffocating me. I told myself it was just a mistake, a lapse in judgment, but deep down I knew better. It had been years in the making, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break free. Ethan didn't give up. He found ways to be near me, even when I pushed him away. When I walked past him in the kitchen, his hand would brush against mine, just for a second. When I went outside, he was always there, watching me with an expression I couldn't bear to meet. One evening, as I gathered the laundry from the clothesline, he stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Are you going to pretend forever?" he asked. I tightened my grip on the basket. "There's nothing to pretend." He exhaled sharply. "Look at me and say that." I didn't. I couldn't. "I know you feel it," he continued. "I know because I see it every time you look at me. You're just too scared to admit it." I set the basket down, my hands shaking. "This isn't about fear. It's about right and wrong." His jaw clenched. "And who decides that? The world? Or you?" I swallowed hard. "Ethan, this can't happen. It was a mistake. We crossed a line that should have never been touched." His eyes darkened. "A mistake?" I forced myself to nod, even as my heart shattered.
Yes.
He let out a bitter laugh.
Right.
"A mistake." He stepped back, running a hand through his hair.
So, what now?
"You pretend I don't exist? You act like that night never happened." I pressed my lips together, refusing to let my emotions take over. "We move on." His face twisted with hurt. "Move on?" "Yes." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Then, his expression hardened.
Fine.
"If that's what you want." I wanted to tell him it wasn't. That every fiber of my being ached for him. That my days felt empty without him beside me. But I said nothing. He turned and walked away, and I stood there, watching him go, feeling like I had just destroyed the one thing I had ever truly wanted. Ethan was gone by morning. No note, no goodbye. Just an empty space where he used to be. The house felt different without him. Quieter. Colder. I told myself it was for the best, that this was how it had to be. But when I passed his room and saw the bed still unmade, the closet half empty, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air, the ache in my chest nearly crushed me. Days turned into weeks. Then months. I went about my routine as if nothing had changed, feeding the horses, mending fences, cooking dinner for one. But the silence followed me everywhere. Then the letters started coming. At first, I ignored them. They sat on the kitchen table, unopened, taunting me. But one night, when the loneliness became too much, I picked one up and ran my fingers over his handwriting. "I miss you." 3 words. That was all it said. I should have thrown it away, but instead, I traced the letters over and over, memorizing the way he wrote my name at the top. More letters followed. Some were long, some were short. Some were angry, others full of longing. He never begged me to change my mind, never asked me to come find him. But I could feel the pain between the lines, the same pain that had taken root in me. I never wrote back. Years passed. Life moved forward. But some things never truly fade. Then one afternoon I got a message from an old friend. Ethan was getting married. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the words, waiting for the relief to come. It never did. That evening, I walked to the barn, the place where everything had changed. The wood was worn, the air inside filled with memories I had tried to bury. I ran my fingers along the beams, remembering the way he had stood there that night, the way his voice had trembled when he told me he loved me. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry." But the only answer was silence. Love doesn't always follow the rules. And some love stories aren't meant to have happy endings.